The Reluctant Decision. On the small, unassuming planet of Kylok, nestled among the shimmering nebula of a distant star system, Thea sat alone in her room. The walls around her were lined with books filled with the knowledge of her people, ancient texts that chronicled the history of their civilization, the deep mysteries of the universe, and the stars they had long since visited. Kylok was a place of peace and intellectual curiosity, its citizens known for their deep appreciation for wisdom and exploration. Yet today, Thea found herself consumed with anxiety, overwhelmed by the weight of a decision that loomed over her, one that threatened to shape the rest of her life. Thea was 25 in Earth years, the time when her people were expected to transition into adulthood and begin their own families. She had always lived her life with a sense of independence and freedom, spending most of her days studying the intricate details of the universe, lost in the mysteries of distant galaxies. She had never been one to follow the traditional norms of her society. Her world was vast, and her curiosity stretched beyond the horizons of her home. She had no interest in marriage or settling down. Love and companionship to her seemed secondary to the pursuit of knowledge. But her parents, Sora and Mara, believed it was time for her to begin this new chapter of her life. They had already decided that she would be a part of the new Intergalactic mating program, a system that had been designed to match individuals from different species across the galaxy, creating alliances and partnerships for the future. Thea had heard of the program. Of course, it was a fairly new initiative, one that aimed to foster relationships between various species across the stars. The idea was noble, meant to bridge gaps between cultures and encourage understanding. Yet the thought of having her life dictated by such a program filled her with dread. She was not interested in simply being paired with some stranger for the sake of tradition or duty. She had other plans, dreams that didn't involve settling down and starting a family. But her parents were insistent. They had already begun the search for her mate, and the decision was no longer in her hands. She could only hope that whoever it was, they would be understanding of her desire for freedom. As Thea sat at her desk, her eyes wandered across the holographic screen that displayed the list of potential mates. She knew this was inevitable, but the reality of it was still difficult to face. She had heard the stories, some good, some bad, about the different species that had been paired with her kind. Some had been successful relationships, where mutual respect and admiration had flourished. Others had ended in disaster, with the participants finding themselves trapped in unhappy unions. But one species in particular made her shudder with apprehension: humans. From the few records she had come across, humans seemed like an aggressive, primitive species. They hailed from a planet called Earth, a place known for its high gravity, harsh climates, and violent history. Humans were infamous for their unruly bodies, their thick, coarse hair, and their fierce, almost brutal nature. Their reputation as a warlike race with a penchant for conflict and violence preceded them wherever they traveled. It wasn't just their physical appearance or their primal instincts that made Thea uneasy. It was their unpredictability. Her people had always valued intellect and harmony, while humans seemed to embrace chaos and struggle. The idea of mating with a human filled Thea with a deep sense of discomfort. The thought of sharing her life with someone from such a violent and unpredictable species was enough to make her stomach twist in knots. What would it be like to live with someone who might not understand her culture, her way of life? What if their values clashed? Or worse, if their instincts were too strong to ignore? Thea didn't want to imagine it. She had heard stories about how humans could be possessive, territorial even, and how their emotions could swing wildly from love to anger in the blink of an eye. It was hard to imagine that such a species could truly understand the delicate balance she had always sought in her own relationships. Her mind raced as she scrolled through the list of potential mates, each name attached to a holographic image of an unfamiliar face, some of them humanoid, others far more alien in appearance. But each time her eyes lingered on the human candidates, a sense of dread washed over her. They were so different. She had heard that humans were known for their resilience, their adaptability, and their loyalty to their mates. Perhaps those qualities would be beneficial in some way. But the stories she had heard of their violence, their wars, their bloodshed, how could such a creature ever be a suitable match for her? Her mind raced as she scrolled through the list of potential mates, each name attached to a holographic image of an unfamiliar face, some of them humanoid, others far more alien in appearance. But each time her eyes lingered on the human candidates, a sense of dread washed over her. They were so different. She had heard that humans were known for their resilience, their adaptability, and their loyalty to their mates. Perhaps those qualities would be beneficial in some way. But the stories she had heard of their violence, their wars, their bloodshed, how could such a creature ever be a suitable match for her? Just as she was about to turn off the screen, her mother's voice interrupted her thoughts, soft but insistent. "Thea, dear, your father, and I need to speak with you," Mara called from outside her door. Thea's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this meant. It was time. Her parents had made their decision, and there was no avoiding it any longer. She sighed deeply, closing the holographic display and standing up from her desk. She was dreading this conversation, but she had no choice but to face it. Her parents, who had always been loving and supportive, had placed their faith in the Intergalactic mating program. And now it was her turn to accept it. With a resigned sigh, Thea walked toward the door, her mind swirling with doubts and fears. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The choice of her mate, the very foundation of her future, was already being shaped without her consent. She only hoped that, somehow, the universe had a plan for her, one that would lead her to a life she could one day embrace. As Thea entered the family room, her parents sat across from each other, their expressions a mixture of excitement and concern. Sora, her father, looked up and smiled warmly at her. "Thea, my dear," he began softly, "your mother and I have been working very hard to find the right match for you, and we believe we have made a wonderful choice." Thea's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew, without a doubt, that her life was about to change in ways she could never have anticipated. Little did she know, the decision her parents had made for her was going to challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the humans she so feared. And it all began with the choice of one man, a human, who would soon become more important to her than she could ever imagine. The unexpected announcement. Thea stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her parents' words hanging in the air like an unbearable burden. The room seemed to close in on her, its familiar, comforting walls now feeling too small, too stifling. She could hear the distant hum of Kylok's winds outside, the sound of nature that had always brought her peace, but now it felt far removed from her turmoil. She had never imagined this moment would come, not like this, not with a human. Her father, Sora, smiled gently at her, though she could see the excitement in his eyes. Her mother, Mara, sat quietly beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression both serene and expectant. They had worked so hard to find a match for her, dedicating their time and energy to the Intergalactic mating program. The idea of forging connections across species was admirable, even noble, but for Thea, it felt like a distant, foreign concept. She had always believed that love, companionship, and family were meant to be natural, not orchestrated by a program designed to match species based on compatibility scores. Thea's thoughts swirled, a maelstrom of confusion, disbelief, and fear. She had never felt ready for this, had never sought out a partner. Her dreams had always been filled with exploration, of the stars, of the unknown wonders that awaited her beyond the borders of Kylok. She had imagined her life as one of discovery, both in the vastness of space and in the pursuit of knowledge. But now, everything she had envisioned seemed out of reach. She was being forced into a future that felt alien, something she had never chosen. "Thea," her father said, his voice warm and reassuring, "we know this may be difficult for you, but your mother and I have put a lot of thought into this. We believe we found someone who will complement you perfectly, someone who can offer you stability, loyalty, and a new kind of partnership. The words were meant to soothe her, but they only stirred her anxiety. Stability, loyalty, were those really the qualities she needed? Could a union, one based purely on genetic compatibility and the logic of a program, ever lead to something as genuine as love? She doubted it. Her mother leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Thea, we've researched this extensively. Humans are incredibly resilient, adaptable, and fiercely loyal to their partners. Your father and I believe that their kind is exactly what you need. They bring balance to your intellect and passion. They've survived in the harshest environments and have built civilizations on their resilience." Thea listened quietly, but her mind remained distant. All she could think of was the brutality she had heard about. Humans were known for their wars, their greed, their violence. Stories from the far reaches of the galaxy had painted them as primitive beings, incapable of understanding the delicate balance of the peaceful worlds like hers. How could her parents believe that a human would be the right match for her, let alone someone with whom she could form a family? "Who is he?" Thea asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she even asked. Perhaps it was an attempt to placate her own growing unease, to shift the conversation to something more tangible. She had already made up her mind about humans, after all. Sora smiled and tapped a few buttons on the holographic console between them. A figure appeared in the air, a projection of the human who would soon become her mate. Thea stared at the hologram, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing tall and imposing, was Callan, the human her parents had chosen. His features were sharp, almost cruel in their intensity, his jaw strong and square, his eyes a piercing shade of green that almost seemed to glow in the hologram's light. He was dressed in what appeared to be advanced battle armor, his posture one of confidence and strength. Thea could see the muscles rippling beneath his dark tactical gear. His presence was commanding, and there was an air of untamed power in his stance. He looked every bit the warrior the stories described, his rugged appearance and powerful frame sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Thea couldn't help it. Her mind flashed to the tales she had heard of Earth, a place of conflict, of constant survival. How could a creature like this ever understand her? "His name is Callan," Mira explained softly, sensing her daughter's unease. "He is from Earth, one of the strongest of their kind. His loyalty is unmatched, and he has proven himself as a protector of his people. He is exactly what we hoped for in a partner for you." Thea looked away from the hologram, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't want to look at him anymore. She had already made up her mind. This was not the life she wanted, not the path she had chosen. "I don't understand," Thea said, her voice trembling. "How can you expect me to accept this? How can you choose someone for me? Especially someone so different?" Her father's expression softened, and he reached out to gently lift her chin, guiding her gaze back to the hologram. "Thea, this isn't just about compatibility or biology. It's about trust. It's about forging a bond between two species, humans and your people, that will help us all grow stronger. And Callan is a good man, despite what you may have heard." Thea's heart raced. "A good man," she repeated, her voice rising in frustration. "How can you know that? You've never even met him. How can you be sure that he's the right one for me?" Her mother's eyes were filled with a quiet wisdom as she spoke. "You'll see, my dear. Sometimes the things we fear the most are the very things that shape us into who we're meant to become. Callan may be different, but that doesn't mean he can't be your match. In fact, that's precisely why he may be the perfect partner for you. He will challenge you, but he will also protect you. And above all, he will stand by you." Thea wanted to argue further, but something in her mother's words struck her. She had always sought the unknown, the challenge. Her curiosity had led her to explore the deepest corners of the universe. Could it be that the very thing she feared, this human, was the key to unlocking a new chapter in her life? The hologram of Callan flickered out, and Thea stood there, her thoughts swirling. She didn't want to admit it, but a small part of her was intrigued. Could a human really understand her world, her values, her beliefs? Or was this all just a dream, one that would shatter the moment she met him? "We've arranged for you to meet him in person," her father continued, sensing the hesitation in her. "He will be here soon. We know this may be difficult, but we believe that once you meet him, you will understand why we chose him for you." Thea couldn't stop herself from asking, "And what if I don't feel the same way? What if I don't want this?" Her mother's voice was gentle but firm. "You may not understand now, Thea, but love isn't always about first impressions. Sometimes it's about seeing the person for who they truly are, beyond the surface. You have a chance to shape your own future, and this is the first step in that journey." As her parents left the room, leaving her to process the gravity of their decision, Thea was left alone with her thoughts. The unknown was coming. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Kalen, the human, would soon be standing before her, and whether she liked it or not, she had to face him. What she didn't know, however, was that this meeting would change everything. Kalen wasn't the brutal, violent creature she imagined. In fact, he might just be the one person who could challenge everything she believed about herself and about love. But for now, she was caught between fear and curiosity, unsure of what the future held, but knowing that she had no choice but to step into it. The unexpected arrival. The days that followed the announcement were some of the longest Thea had ever experienced. Her mind refused to quiet, consumed by thoughts of the human her parents had chosen for her. Kalen. The name echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, and despite her attempts to bury her unease, it lingered, growing stronger with each passing hour. The hologram of him, the warrior, the soldier, had left a lasting impression. She couldn't shake the image of his intense green eyes, the sharp, calculated demeanor he carried so effortlessly. Everything about him screamed power, dominance, and survival. Her parents had given her little time to adjust. The arrangements had already been made. Kalen would arrive in just a few days, and no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, she couldn't stop the feeling of anticipation creeping into her chest. She couldn't focus on her studies anymore. Her usual distractions had lost their allure. Instead, she spent hours pacing her room, staring out the window at the stars beyond, wondering about the unknowns that awaited her. Her thoughts were chaotic, torn between fear and curiosity. Could a human really be the right partner for her? Could she look beyond his origins and see him as more than the brutal warrior her people had long feared? The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. Her mind told her to run, to avoid this union, but something in the pit of her stomach told her to face it. The thought of the meeting was inescapable now. The morning of his arrival, Thea woke early, her nerves already stretched thin. She stared at herself in the mirror, running her fingers through her long, silver hair. She had always prided herself on her self-control, her ability to stay composed no matter the situation. But today, everything felt out of her control. She had spent her life analyzing the galaxy and its species, but now she was about to meet one of them face to face, the one she had feared and misunderstood for so long. Her mother had already arranged for them to meet at the spaceport, where Kalen's ship would land. It seemed like an ordinary day for everyone else, but for Thea, this was the moment that would change everything. She had no idea what she was walking into. Would he be as she feared? Would his presence be overwhelming, intimidating? Or would she find something entirely different in him? Something that defied everything she had been taught about humans. As she arrived at the spaceport with her parents, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Thea could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of ships arriving and departing filled the air, the bustle of activity doing little to calm her nerves. The large metal doors of the landing pad were slowly opening, and the crowd of workers and travelers parted to allow the ships to land. Thea's eyes darted around, but she found herself unable to focus on anything except the ship that was about to arrive. It was sleek and powerful, an unfamiliar design that seemed to shimmer under the sunlight. The sound of the landing thrusters echoed throughout the spaceport, and with it came a fresh surge of fear. Then the ship's engines powered down, and the world seemed to pause. Her father, Sora, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's here, Thea. You can do this." Thea barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the ramp that extended from the ship. She had no idea what to expect, no idea what kind of man Callan was. What if he was everything she feared? What if her instincts were right? Would she be able to trust him? But as the ramp descended and the first figure stepped out into the daylight, Thea's breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, taller than she had imagined, and his posture was strong and commanding. He wore a form-fitting suit of advanced armor, metallic and sleek, with a dark blue hue that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. His helmet was a reflective visor, hiding his face, but even from a distance, Thea could feel his presence. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, his energy unmistakable. Callan stepped forward, his movements deliberate, each step exuding confidence. The ship behind him seemed to recede into the background as his imposing figure became the center of attention. Thea's mind was reeling. He didn't look like the brutish creature she had imagined. He didn't look like the violent warrior she had heard about in stories. Instead, there was an almost quiet strength in his every movement, an air of control and calm that both unsettled and intrigued her. When Callan reached the bottom of the ramp, he paused, scanning the crowd. His eyes, visible now through the reflection of his helmet, locked onto Thea. The moment their gazes met, an unexpected jolt ran through her. It wasn't the terror she had expected. It wasn't even disgust. It was curiosity, a strange pull that caught her completely off guard. For a brief moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. His eyes were the color of the deep ocean, and in them she saw something unfamiliar, a sense of understanding, of calm determination that she couldn't quite place. Then he took off his helmet, revealing his face for the first time. Thea felt her heart skip a beat. His features were sharp, his jaw strong, but there was something else in his expression, something softer than she had imagined. His hair was short, dark brown, and his skin had the faintest tan, as though he had spent much of his life under the sun. His eyes, now fully visible, held a depth to them that Thea hadn't expected. They were not the fierce, angry eyes of a warrior, but rather the eyes of someone who had lived through hardship and yet remained composed. His gaze was steady, yet there was a glimmer of something else, curiosity, as if he too was trying to make sense of her. "Hello, Thea," he said, his voice deep and calm. There was no aggression, no challenge in his tone, only a simple greeting, as if he were meeting an old friend for the first time. Thea felt her breath hitch. He was nothing like she had imagined. Her thoughts raced, but for the first time in days, her mind wasn't consumed by fear or uncertainty. There was something about him, something different from the stories she had heard. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a creature to be feared. Instead, he seemed human, real. And despite all the stories of violence and conflict, there was something in his gaze that made her want to take a step forward. Her father spoke, breaking the moment of silence. "Thea, this is Callan. We've arranged a meeting so you can get to know him better. He is here to stay." Callan turned his gaze toward her father, then back to Thea. His expression softened slightly. "It's an honor to meet you, Thea," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that made Thea pause. He wasn't what she had expected at all. She didn't know what to say in return. She had prepared herself for confrontation, for an adversary she would have to outwit, but this was different. She swallowed, forcing herself to speak. "It's nice to meet you too, Callan." There was a long pause between them, the air thick with the tension of their unspoken thoughts. But as Thea looked at him, she realized that this was just the beginning of a journey she had never prepared for. She was standing before a human, a warrior, a stranger, a potential mate, but he was not the image of brutality she had envisioned. There was so much more to him, and whether she liked it or not, she would soon have to discover what lay beneath the surface. Thea felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of hope stir in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this encounter wouldn't be as impossible as she had thought.